Thank you all for joining us tonight. And special thanks to our lecturer for the evening, Professor Zielonka, and to Professor Kühnhardt, Director at the Center for European Integration Studies at Bonn University, for agreeing to moderate this discussion. Welcome to this online event. Jan Zielonka is Professor of European Politics at the University of Oxford and Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Venice, Ca' Foscari. Tonight, he will be attempting to assess the success and failure of the European Union, of this ambitious democratic experiment, this unique mixture of multi-level governance, economic integration, and multilateral diplomacy. After all, never before has any democratic project of such a scale been attempted beyond the nation-state. The political system of the European Union is often being criticized. It's being described from rigid and time-consuming to non-transparent and undemocratic. However, its apologists reply that there is indeed democratic legitimacy. The MEPs are elected and so are the governments, while the Commission is approved by the elected parliament. To enhance democracy within the European communities and then the European Union has been part of the further development of this unique construction for decades. From bringing the European Parliament up to direct elections in 1979, to a steady increase in competences for the only directed elected European institution, to the attempt of introducing a European Constitution, the European Democracy Action Plan, or very recently, the adoption of transnational voting lists for the European elections. Efforts to enhance democratic legitimacy for decisions taken at European level have been numerous. A push for enhancing citizens' direct participation, the Conference on the Future of Europe, was completed last week with a report requesting the upholding of democratic values in all member states, and the creation of a full civic experience for Europeans for effective participation, ensuring that their voice would be heard also in between elections. The report interestingly calls for making the European elections more European and for introducing a Europe-wide referendum. Among the further ideas are a user-friendly digital platform on which citizens could share ideas, put forward questions, and provide input into legislation. Also, periodical citizens' assemblies are suggested, and prior involvement of citizens is seen as an important basis for political decisions. It remains to be seen which of these innovations will be taken over into the European political system. Dear Professor Zielonka, dear participants, the debate on what kind of Europe we would like to have is much older than the Union itself. Various examples of visions for Europe are exhibited in the permanent exhibition of the House of European History. For the challenges of today, what kind of changes are needed to the way the EU is governed? Should we aim to complement the existing arrangement with something new, a new community, as suggested by President Macron, or only improve what we have? How do we achieve maximum transparency and accountability? How do we address the present challenges to democracy, both at European and at national level? The list of questions goes on and on. So I'm very much looking forward to listening to your ideas tonight. Once again, thank you very much for being with us. I wish you a very fruitful debate, and now I hand over to Professor Zielonka for his keynote speech.
Many thanks for this very kind and wide-ranging introduction. I'm very pleased to be with you tonight. And the topic is important, but it is often underestimated. We all know that European Union is a remarkable experiment in economic integration, in multilateral diplomacy, and multi-level governance. But we somehow take it for granted that it is also a very courageous experiment in democracy. Because never before in history, an equally ambitious democratic project has in fact been attempted beyond nation state. The problem is that this experiment so far has not generated as much legitimacy as needed and expected, and therefore we should ask the question, why? And we should also try to envisage alternative paths of making EU more democratic, and we just heard some proposals coming from the Conference on the Future of Europe. So why do I argue that this was courageous experiment? Is it not normal that we expect the EU to be democratic? Well, you may say that it is enough that the EU is composed of member states which are democratic. And you may also argue, as many famous people do, that democracy can hardly exist in other units than states. I'll just give you an example. We do not, do we expect from firms to be democratic? Do we expect from international organizations to be democratic? After all, key decisions in the United Nations are being taken by the Security Council, which is hardly representative of the UN member states and the electorates. Shareholders taking decisions, business firms, may well be representatives, but we don't make claims that firms are democratic. Have you ever heard about this? We expect from non-state institutions and their officials to be responsive, accountable, fair. But the term democracy is usually reserved for nation states and no other bodies. In fact, most famous thinkers like Ralph Dahrendorf or Juan Linz, who wrote about democracy a lot, they always argued that only states can be democratic. Why they do this? And they do this because democracy as we know it emerged in a process of state and nation formation. And it is difficult to replicate this process in different settings. For instance, the system of democratic representation can hardly work properly without what? Without a clearly defined demos. And we don't have such a demos above nation states. In the EU, you have a plural demo which do not necessarily form a coherent whole. Moreover, democracy needs to envisage a considerable degree of citizens' participation. But this participation of you and me is difficult to envisage in a very large regional unit, let alone global one, right? Because the center of governance is very far from citizens. And also democracy entails a defined common territory. Without clear and fairly hard borders, it is not possible to establish where the democratic jurisdiction applies, and actors can escape some jurisdictions by moving freely across a borderless space. So in sum, a respected body of literature reasons that democracy does not only require creation of some democratic institutions, such as parliaments, elections, constitutions. It also requires territorial borders that correspond and coincide with systemic functional boundaries. what I mean by systemic function and boundaries, it means that economic, cultural, administrative, and legal borders coincide. These arguments were somehow dismissed in the process of European integration. European leaders never declared the intention to build a European state. And yet, they decided to make the EU democratic, with European Parliament at the center of this project. And this risky jump into unknown has been justified in a variety of ways. Why they have done it? Well, because EU is progressively granted ever more powers. And there was a pressure to legitimize those decisions. If you have powers, you have to somehow legitimize those powers. Moreover, successive waves of EU enlargement made it difficult to reach decisions by consensus. And so majority decisions within European Council were progressively introduced. And they also required legitimization, because it meant that the state-based democracy can be outvoted, right? An additional reason was that unlike the story that democracy can be only in nation states, there were other democracy theories who argued the opposite, that democracy actually started already in the city-state. Think about Greece. And there was a different kind of democracy in ancient Greece. It was basically assembly of minor elite with no parliamentary representations, as we later learn in nation states. In fact, at the time, there was no nation. Nations emerged only in 17th, 18th century. And today we can say that we have not a nation state or city state, but we have a digital state with totally new opportunities for deliberation and participation. So we can envisage maybe a different kind of democracy than democracy we have in nation states. Yet, the authors of European democracy project have taken a different path. They, in a way, adopted a model of democracy which we know from nation states without declaring union to be a state. I will spare you details of all treaties. But as you very well know, the model of democracy which we have in Europe is based on parliamentary representation. But things are a bit more complicated here. Why? Because EU is composed of, and in fact controlled by member states. And all these member states, they have their own parliaments. So the increased parliamentary representation at the European level unavoidably clashes with the member states' parliaments, right? And if you give national parliaments more responsibility in determining the course of European policy, as it was in the Lisbon Treaty, it actually doesn't mitigate possible conflicts, because the European and national parliaments represent different constituencies. It may sound complicated, but they just represent different people. Moreover, and probably more crucially, the European Council, the Council of the EU, has always been the key legislator, on the assumption that it represents democratically elected government. So not just European Parliament, but the Council was a legislator. And these member states claim legitimacy from the popular vote. In fact, more and more we could see that those national executives tend to bypass their respective national parliaments by making decisions in the Council, which was then difficult to change when you went for a vote to the national parliament. How many times politicians, prime minister, came from European summit and said, look, dear parliamentarians, I know that you are sovereign, but you cannot just pick and choose what we negotiated. You have to take the whole package. Take it or leave it. We cannot start negotiating anew, right? You know this story. You have to each European Council who had this situation. That parliaments, national parliaments, which tend or claim to be sovereign, they just basically have to rubber stamp decision taking by executives within the Council. Moreover, the European parliamentary practice is peculiar in itself. The European Parliament does not have a governing cabinet or a governing program to sustain or oppose. And despite all the treaties, particularly introduced by the Lisbon Treaty, the Parliament, the Commission, and the Council are still relatively independent, and cleavages within European Parliament still break along national lines and not just party affiliations, as it all sometimes by some professors assumed. So what we have as a result, we have a half-baked and pretty hybrid parliamentary representation in Europe, which struggles to be recognized by Europe's citizens as superior and sufficiently respected by non-majoritarian European institutions, such as non-majoritarian, bodies which are not directly elected. What are those bodies? The Commission, the Council, the European Central Bank, and the European Court of Justice. So in fact, although we have given European Parliament more and more power with each treaty, we have seen that less and less people bother to vote in these elections. And if this election, and those elections were usually, kind of popularity contests for the ruling national governments. And true, the last elections mobilized more voters than the previous ones. But the result was that we have more Eurosceptic politicians in this parliament than ever. They do not form majority yet, but they can block many important decisions. You know it from the parliamentary practice. So the system is not perfect, to put it mildly. And of course, you can say it's not perfect, but it's still functioning better than parliamentary representation in member states. Opinion polls show it. More people in Europe are unhappy with their parliaments, national parliaments, than European ones. Some even go so far, that particularly young people in recent studies showed that they would feel well about reducing the number of national parliamentarians in their country and give those seats to artificial intelligence with access to their data. Half of respondents, particularly young, were enthusiastic about this. Well, we've got a problem here, right? And you can say, okay, the system is still new. It's an experiment in making, full of paradoxes, if not absurdities. But you know, this European process of integration is not so young any longer. And I never had the answer how long we have to wait for it to work properly. 5 years, 2 years, 5 decades. And things are moving fast. Decisions have to be made. In fact, since financial crisis and then migratory crisis and then health crisis, and now we have security crisis, well, they all force us to quick decisions, which in the way make it even more difficult for parliaments to step in. Do we have any alternatives, ways to involve parliamentarians? Do we have other ways of giving citizens the voice and not just the vote in European system? Can we increase their participation? Is there much participations of citizens? Not really. People can write petitions. They can request access to documents. They can ask the ombudsman to argue their case, but the ombudsman is chosen by European Parliament and reports to it. We have right now an excellent ombudsman, but she's not getting answers from European bodies to very pressing questions she puts on the table. So there is clearly a problem. And more decisions have to be taken with no consultations and little regard for the treaty arrangements. And there is no viable mechanism of mediating and legitimizing different positions, if not conflicts. So there is this enormous expectation that the union will take things in its hands, on which it either cannot deliver in efficiency terms, and if it's even efficient, it is difficult for people to feel ownership of those decisions. They think those decisions were made somewhere behind their backs. And we have common policy making without common politics. And technocrats can shape policy making, but populists are able to dominate politics. This is more and more the problem. And we have to get out of the vicious circle. And as we heard, direct democracy is more kind of a rescue route envisaged. But so far, those referenda were the hours of not citizens' participation, but of populist excesses. Think about 2015 referendum in Greece, 2016 referendum in Great Britain, 2016 referendum in Hungary on migrants relocation, or in Holland on Ukraine associations with the EU. They all basically were done on the national level, although they concerned purely European issues. And they were not success. They didn't make people anymore happy that they really have any significant say on European matters. So we have to do something about this. And I will finish with two very contrasting options, totally different. One is probably familiar to you. It is a step towards a European federation, a kind of United States of Europe with a fully fledged parliamentary representation. The other is less pronounced, but it is really empirically more visible. It is a step towards a Europe of networks, with power being dispersed and brought closer to Europe's citizens. Both steps would represent a journey into unknown, pregnant with multiple risks. But the prospects of Europe's disintegrating seems much riskier in comparison. So we have to try to experiment. We have to choose an options, but which one? The two I mentioned are totally opposite, totally opposite. The first, to create European Federation, seems very straightforward, but it's more complicated as many of us think. Partly because the fully fledged democratic representations, as I mentioned earlier, exist only on the national level. And we don't know that it can be replicated at the European level successfully. And you cannot do it by decree, so to speak. Because, for instance, how you envisage some democratic deliberation in numerous languages and in numerous cultural codes of understanding? It's not only about values defined very vaguely usually. It's about kind of feeling that we understand each other, that we speak the same language, even though we use different language, you see. It is about arriving at the common definitions of interest. And this requires not just common procedures. And we still have to accept that European center will be always further away from ordinary citizens than national center. Because how can we imagine that Brussels will be closer to citizens equally, you know, in Latvia and Cyprus? Yeah? And maybe pan-European system of parliamentary representations will not bridge this gap. We don't know. Most importantly, you see, the European project has been created by member states who control this project. And creating a European federations would basically mean that those states will dissolve themselves, they transform themselves in the local government. Well, this would be equivalent of collective suicide. And this explains why they've never done this. Because they will have to, you know, delegate these powers to other bodies and themselves lose the raison d'etre. So therefore, the second alternative option has to be considered. Partly because it will not dissolve states. It would allow those states to exist, probably as the most important actor still. But they would not have any longer monopoly on decisions, as is the case today. So the diversity will have to be embraced and hierarchy will be reduced. So more emphasis will be put on voluntary associations and less on territorial governance. Who should be allowed to join the decision-making table? In my view, cities, regions, NGOs, and even firms. You know, I prefer firms to argue the case in second chamber of European Parliament, for instance, than in the corridors of the, you know, Bredel, where European decisions are being made, in restaurants around Place Schumann. No, I'd rather have no lobbying, but transparent interest defense. So European governance structure will not look then like pyramid, but like a junction box with numerous points of interactions and intersection. And you can say, okay, how can you oversee this complex network? This would be indeed more complicated. But don't forget, this would mean dispersing power and bringing it closer to citizens and their concerned. You know, there is more need to control power which is concentrated, hierarchical. When power is being dispersed, divided between different actors, then by the same token, they are closer to the problems we are going to address. I'm saying those things because sometimes this is considered as no option. But when I look at Europe today, it is already very much a Europe of networks, where flexible arrangements, fluid membership, variable purpose, and a net of concentric functional frames of cooperations are already daily practice. And this doesn't mean anarchy. This doesn't prevent any democratic arrangements. Networks are not floating islands. They are still being controlled by laws on individual countries. They are still being scrutinized by the media. But we somehow are afraid of this option as much, and we are sometimes afraid of options which basically give all the powers to imagine European states. And digital technology can help us here, and the Future of Europe conference pointed to this very clearly. The problem is that the internet cannot relieve us from basic dilemmas of European integrations. What are these dilemmas? Where should key powers be located? How to legitimize transnational arrangements in a very complex multiply polities like Europe? And to address these pertinent questions, we need to define the relationship between authority, territory, rights, and identity in Europe. So we have two contrasting options: European federations of Eurobond networks. We should go for one of them because the alternative is going back to nation states, bringing ghosts of history back into Europe. And we have enough serious problems today on our hands, starting with war, going to poverty, environmental degradation, crisis of social policies, and management of multi-ethnic societies to cope with. We cannot allow this scenario to be simply dismantled. I mean, when I talk about scenario of Europe, integrated Europe going further. Here I end.
Thank you very much, Professor Zielonka, for this very inspiring lecture, which raises a lot of questions. I will take the questions from the audience and also moderate the debate, but I would like to start with a known question following what you said. You described two options, and you seem to think that federation is not realistic, is not within reach at the moment. So you seem to be advocating for a Europe of networks. And to link this to the current institutional framework, I wanted to ask you, as the cities, regions, NGOs, and firms that you bring into the play, they are currently represented in the Committee of the Regions and the Economic and Social Committee. Would you advise also to remain within this institutional framework, or to go into something totally new, to listen to these networks as you describe them? And where in this construction would be the voter? Where would be the possibility for the European citizens to express who they would like to be represented by? Or are you advocating against representative democracy, or that this should be in the first chamber? So these would be my questions, reacting immediately to what you said.
Look, right now, let's take the cities as an example, right? Today, I spoke to the mayor of Salerno about the policies during COVID. Formally, cities have no powers on medical issues. Nation states, when the COVID broke out, closed borders, prevented even medical goods to be shipped from one single market country to another. And they said, we are now in charge. Well, the region said, sorry, but for health issues, the regions in most countries are, really governments which are in charge of health. In Germany, in Italy, in most countries. No, thank you very much. Don't mingle with us. The head of the region of Campania, where I'm speaking from, basically said, I don't want people, I don't mind French people traveling to Italy. What I mind is people from Milano, where there's an outbreak of virus, coming to Campania, to the summer houses, and spreading the virus. And very soon we learn, and the head of this Campania region also said, well, actually, I'm going to produce vaccines here in Campania, first for our people, then for the rest of the Italians. The head of the Veneto region, just to go outside Campania, so we don't think this is only there, said, well, we don't want to produce ourselves, these vaccines. We just take Sputnik from Russia ourselves, and we won't wait for Brussels or Rome to tell us what to do. Of course, very quickly they realized that they also need European Union to negotiate serious deals on vaccines. Your Commission didn't do a very good job at the beginning, but very quickly it improved its record. But at the end of the day, cities which didn't have major powers here had to deal with COVID on their own. Why? Because as it happened, all center of infections were in the cities. For the obvious reasons, not only that majority of Europeans already live in cities, but also because the density of life, in Venice, where I teach, plagues were from the Middle Ages. the term quarantena, came from the Middle Ages Venice, because it meant basically 40 days of isolations. They were stuck with the COVID. They had to handle it to make sure that that hospital work, that streets are being clean, the transport is safe, and eventually schools move to online or regain transport. They didn't have any formal powers. They had to find solutions for problems which the state and regions wanted to govern. And the union also tried to participate in the sovereignty conflict. Or take the immigration issue. Cities have no formal powers on migration. These are states which are issuing law on migration, correct? There is also European Union because there is a Schengen border. But where those migrants end up? They don't end up on Place Schumann. They don't end up on, on Quirinale in Rome. They end up in suburbs of major cities, where the migrants have to be taken care of, that the mayors have to find shelter for them, that they have to integrate to the local community, and so on and so on. Why I'm saying about those things? Because I can even continue. If you think where you find a job, do you think about the national government or you think about the city? Where you have to find a school for your children, when you have to find medical care for your parents. Is it the city or is it the state or you? They are all involved. But as it happens, the major powers are not in the hands of cities. And we had a Pact of Amsterdam, which declared we invite cities to make contributions to European governance. Thank you very much. They noticed that cities exist. But it is not good enough. And I'm not even talking about the fact that city authorities are much closer to citizens and can legitimate things like, for instance, today the mayor of Salerno was saying to me, look, all these decisions about lockdowns were very hard for people. All these decisions to vaccinate, to wear masks, they required legitimacy. I had to go to talk on the street to people who knew me personally. You see what I mean? So you cannot have the gap in which cities are only decision takers and not decision makers.
Or influencers.
The states have a dinner and the cities can wash dishes. And they eventually beg for some money from the European Union. And this money will go through the state because member states decide about this. You see what I mean? This gap is unsustainable. But I don't have to talk about cities. I can go to talk about NGOs. If you care about the environment, would you go to your national government with the hope that they will fix, that they deliver on their promises? Or would you join the NGO if you are a young person? You see, if you care about human rights, the same. Who does the job for migrants? States or NGOs?
Could I then ask you, because I would like to move to the questions in the chat, if we go a level further down and we look at civic participation. So there's a question in the chat about your opinion about the Conference of the Future of Europe, you and other forms of direct participation. You briefly touched upon that, and I would perhaps add to that you said in your lecture that some referenda at national level failed. Would you then be in favor of EU-wide referenda, or which kind of citizen participation would you advocate for? And in which form? Because you said that the digital format wouldn't solve all problems. What would then be the right format to do this?
Look, I'm certainly against in national referenda on Europe, because you have referendum in one country affected situations of other countries, right? I'm less skeptical, but still skeptical about Europe-wide referenda, because the practice of referenda shows that they work only on issues close to the citizens' daily concerns and not on big strategic issues. So they and each time there is a big strategic issues like Brexit, for instance, should we leave or stay in the European Union, or like in Greece, the package, financial package, then these referenda proved to be an hour of populist and not democratic deliberations. Though, because what is the nature of referendum? Referendum reduces very complex issue to the very simple alternative, yes or not. And what is even worse, the winner takes it all. There is nothing for the loser. I would prefer a system in which more actors are part of the decision-making process and they have to bargain with each other. They have to argue with each other. And the loser is protected. So the winner doesn't take it all. And this winner usually is a very tiny percentage. So there is no incentive in the referenda when the winner takes it all to any compromise. There's no incentive to compromise. And democracy, which doesn't consider compromise, is for me simply unacceptable. Because we are different, we need to live with each other. Democracy should sort our differences. And the referendum just polarizes us. And we have enough polarizations on the web already, to introduce the same polarizations into referenda. So frankly, I would prefer a system where we have to bargain and where the minority is protected.
So basically, debates are necessary. No decision without prior bargaining or debates.
Yes, but if the referendum, if there is no debate but shouting match, and if the winner takes it all, the whole nature of the exercise is basic. It creates what basically conflicts.
Thank you. So you mentioned scrutiny through the media, and we have a question in the chat, which is about the fact that Russian media are currently forbidden in the European Union, and the person is worried about that. So scrutiny by which media? How should it happen?
There are various media, and all of the, I happen to work on democracy in the media a lot. And I learned, first of all, when you want to talk about media, you have to talk about market and money, because you cannot have proper media without investments. And as it happened, those who make those investments, they usually want to influence the content of the media. So we have to understand that the media work in the context not only of democracy, but also market. And here sometimes there is, as you say, I don't want to have accountability of the media run along the partisan financial interests. Let's put it this way. Internet, on the one hand, gives opportunity of many of us to have alternative sources of communication and transparency. But as we also know, internet platforms are very much monopolized now in the hands of very few extremely resourceful firms. This is not serving public interest. And we go for solutions which I find doubtful. For instance, we ask Facebook to control the content, which means censoring. But is Facebook really, do I want Facebook to be in charge of censoring? I'm not so sure. Why not the public institutions take here lead on this rather than just push the back, on those firms? So we are only at the beginning of understanding how internet has changed public discourse, and we are always behind those entrepreneurs who who make millions of this and whose position is monopolistic. Having said that, I don't belong to those who demonize digital technologies, because I see a lot of opportunities. You know, like these discussions that the internet kills democracy makes me think about discussions when I was younger that the television kills democracy. And I know that during French Revolution, there was an argument that the free press and pamphlets are killing democracy. Well, no, look, new technologies of communication give us opportunities, but also create dangers, and we have to handle it together. And I actually ask myself why e-democracy is much more utilized by networks rather than states. Why, why cities are much better in digitalizing communication than nation states. And when I mean using e-democracy, I don't mean only technology, because important is not how you basically communicate, but the substance is important too. So you see, but to finish, I would say this. Most of what I said suggests that we should go out of kind of traditional parliamentary scrutiny to something what scholars call monetary democracy by non-traditional democratic actors. Because people are increasingly unhappy in the way in which parliament actually are able to scrutinize the executives. And we need transparency, which is breaks sometimes by hackers, you see. And and these whistleblowers, which are very often persecuted by the same state. I'm very worried about this. I'm very worried about this, because this is exactly, particularly now during war, the danger is that we are not able to have any transparency. And we have to be very wary about that.
Yeah, so basically, if I take the last question that we have in the chat, and you already touched upon this, the question is how decentralized technology, which doesn't know any borders, like blockchain, impacts the forms of democracy. So I would add to that, if the internet is global, that adds another form of another layer to the complex multi-level governance that we have. So how would you, in this respect, think that the markets, the global markets, and the dominance of these firms relate to the different levels of democracy that we need?
Well, this is not a big topic. A lot of colleagues say that democracy is impotent because basically markets won over democracy. But this leads to my argument. You see, the disjunction, territorial disjunction between democracy based only on the nation states and markets which are global in nature, where democracy cannot operate efficiently, or creates situation in which markets prevail, because markets do not recognize state borders any longer. No, of course, states is able to regulate here and so, but we know that the ability of democracy to discipline markets is limited. We know this. But we don't have democratic equivalent on other territorial units than nation states. And this exactly allows those markets to operate without any democratic oversight. I don't want authority to interfere on everything towards markets. But I believe that the major decisions concerning citizens have to be taken by the sovereign, which are citizens, and not markets who represent stakeholders. the notions of a stakeholder or a notion of a consumer is that different than the notions of citizen. But we more and more talking about governance in terms of we are taking for consumers and not as for citizens, and I find it extremely problematic.
Yes, thank you very much. We have come to the end of our talk tonight. I heard you advocating for dispersing the power and bringing it closer to citizens in the form of a Europe of networks, if I understood you correctly, which should be scrutinized by the citizens, but also by media, and actually a new form of democracy, which does not mean transposing national systems of democracy to a European level, but thinking about a totally new model of junctions and networks, like a junction box rather than a pyramid. So thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. I would like to remind our audience that this is part of the Envisioning Europe lecture series, which will where we will invite other prominent speakers over the next year to think about Europe and its future. Thank you very much, Professor Zielonka, for being with us tonight.
Thank you.